There are movies that entertain, and then there are movies that become part of who you are. The Lion King is the second kind. Released in 1994, it swept through every corner of popular culture with a force nobody inside Disney had genuinely expected, and it has never really left. Generations of children grew up with it. Adults who watched it as kids still feel something tighten in their chest during certain scenes. The music is embedded so deeply in collective memory that a single opening note can silence a room. But here is what most people who love this film have never been told. The version they know and cherish almost didn't exist. The journey from early concept to finished film was filled with abandoned ideas, creative breakdowns, technical gambles, natural disasters, legal battles, and decisions that could have gone catastrophically wrong at almost every turn. The secrets hidden inside this production are not minor footnotes. They are the real story of how one of the greatest animated films ever made actually came to be. Start with something that will immediately reframe how you think about this movie. When Disney's animation department was deciding where to invest its best talent and highest expectations in the early 1990s, The Lion King was not the answer. The studio had a clear favorite, and it was Pocahontas. That was the project seen as a prestigious one, the artistic statement, the film worthy of the top directors, the most experienced animators, and the most careful attention. The Lion King, by contrast, was viewed as something experimental and uncertain. It had no fairy tale source material, no beloved novel to adapt, no built-in audience waiting to see it. It was an original story set in Africa with talking animals, and the studio's confidence in it was, at best, cautious. Most of the senior talent passed on it, without much deliberation. What happened next is one of the great ironies in the history of animation. The artists and writers who chose The Lion King did so precisely because the expectations were low. They had creative freedom. They could take risks and push boundaries in ways the flagship project simply wouldn't allow. The pressure was somewhere else, and that absence of pressure turned out to be the single most important factor in shaping what the film eventually became. The supposed backup project went on to become one of the highest-grossing animated films in history. Pocahontas opened to a far quieter reception. The movie nobody fought to be a part of ended up defining an entire era. Even the title was not always what audiences came to know. During the earliest stages of development, the working title was King of the Jungle, which sounds adventurous enough until you realize that lions do not actually live in jungles, which should tell you something about how loosely defined the project was at that point. It was a placeholder, a temporary label for a concept that had not yet found its identity. As the writing deepened and the themes of legacy, loss, guilt, and responsibility began to take shape, the title started feeling more like a liability than an asset. The switch to The Lion King was more than a branding decision. It was the moment the team realized what kind of film they were actually making. That change in 4 words signaled a shift in ambition that affected everything that followed. When the story was first pitched to Disney executives, someone described it as Bambi in Africa. Those 3 words were designed to make the concept feel safe and familiar, to connect an untested original idea to something the studio already trusted and understood. It worked well enough to get the project moving forward, but it barely touched the surface of what the film would eventually become. The Bambi comparison made sense as a sales pitch in 1990, but by the time the production was in full swing, it was completely inadequate. The film had grown into something far more ambitious, drawing not from gentle nature fables, but from Shakespeare and ancient mythology. The hero's journey structure that ultimately shaped the story is one of the oldest narrative frameworks in human history, used across cultures and centuries to tell stories about young people who must face impossible loss and return transformed. Simba's arc maps onto it with near-perfect precision. The call to adventure, the fall into exile, the discovery of a mentor, the confrontation with the past, and the return home to claim a place that was always rightfully his. Structuring the story around that mythic backbone gave every scene a sense of inevitability. It made the emotional beats feel earned rather than manufactured. The Hamlet parallel runs so deep through this film that once you see it, you cannot unsee it. A king is betrayed and murdered by his own brother. The throne is seized. The rightful heir is cast out into exile. The parallels were absolutely deliberate, and the creative team leaned into them throughout development. But the writers made one change to the Shakespearean structure that completely transforms the emotional experience of the story. In Hamlet, the prince knows the truth about his father's death and is paralyzed by the weight of that knowledge. Simba does not know the truth. He believes, because Scar has carefully and cruelly made him believe, that he is responsible for Mufasa's death. He is not running from justice. He is running from a lie that has been planted inside him with surgical precision. That false guilt is what drives him into years of avoidance, and what makes his eventual return so powerful. He is not seeking revenge. He is confronting a version of himself that was built on something that was never real. Creating an authentic world to hold that story required more than imagination. A team of artists traveled to Kenya to study African wildlife and landscapes firsthand. They sketched the terrain, observed animal behavior, absorbed the colors of savanna at different times of day, and watched predators move through their natural environment. They saw beauty and danger existing together without contradiction, and that duality became central to the film's visual and emotional identity. Many of the most iconic images in the movie, the sweeping skies, the golden plains at sunrise, the textures of rock and dry grass, trace directly back to field sketches made during that journey. The world on screen was not invented. It was observed, felt, and then translated into animation with extraordinary care. Audiences could sense its authenticity even without being able to explain it. And that groundedness is a large part why the film's world has always felt so completely real. Behind the camera, the production itself was not without fracture. Early in development, the film had two directors working together, but creative disagreement about the role of music in the story created a tension that eventually became impossible to sustain. One of the directors chose to leave voluntarily. It was not a dramatic firing or a studio intervention. It was a philosophical difference that had grown into something neither person could work around. And while losing a director mid-production sounds like the beginning of a disaster, the opposite happened. With one vision removed, the remaining team found clarity. Decisions that had been complicated by competing instincts became straightforward. The musical elements that had caused the disagreement were fully embraced, and the film leaned hard into its theatrical, emotionally grand identity. That tonal confidence, the ability to move from a breathtaking musical sequence to an intimate, devastating dramatic scene without losing coherence, came from a team that was finally aligned. The opening sequence of the film is one of the most audacious creative choices in the history of animated cinema, and most people who love it have never stopped to fully examine why it works so powerfully. Before a single word of dialogue is spoken, the entire world of the film is established through music alone. The first vocal sound instantly communicates scale, cultural richness, ancient tradition, and emotional stakes. Viewers are transported before they have processed anything intellectually. Most animated films of that era open with lighter, more accessible moments, easing audiences gradually into the story. This film did the opposite, with absolute confidence. It opened at full grandeur and demanded complete attention from the first frame. Every animal gathering, every sweeping landscape shot, every moment of that sequence is choreographed to the rhythm of the score in a way that is closer to opera than to traditional animation. That decision paid off so completely that the opening became one of the most recognized sequences in cinema history, a proof that animation could command the same emotional authority as any live-action epic. One scene in the film did not just serve the story. It changed the entire animation industry. The wildebeest stampede required hundreds of animals moving independently through a confined space with camera angles that swooped and shifted in ways hand-drawn animation simply could not achieve. To pull it off, the team turned to computer-generated imagery in a way no Disney feature had attempted before. Software was developed specifically to simulate crowd behavior, giving each animal slightly different timing, speed, and direction, so the herd felt chaotic and alive rather than mechanically copied. The camera was treated like a live-action instrument, tracking, panning, and diving through the scene with the freedom of a real cinematographer. The result was a sequence that felt genuinely cinematic in a way audiences had not experienced in animation before. Future productions would look to that scene as proof that computer-assisted techniques could deliver spectacle on a massive scale, without sacrificing emotional impact. It became a landmark moment, and the technology developed for it influenced animated filmmaking for years afterward. Not every secret from this film is a story of triumph. Some are stranger and more human. During a quiet nighttime scene, Simba collapses on a cliff and sends a cloud of dust into the air. For a brief moment, the particles seemed to form letters, and fans became convinced those letters spelled something inappropriate. The story spread rapidly, fueled by freeze-frame screenshots and playground rumors, long before the internet made such debates routine. The reality is considerably less scandalous. The letters were always meant to spell SFX, a small inside joke from the special effects team, a hidden signature buried in a visual effect that was never intended to carry any meaning beyond a playful nod between colleagues. Motion blur and low-resolution home video made the letters ambiguous enough that once the rumor took hold, it became nearly impossible to correct. That dust cloud became part of the film's cultural mythology, endlessly repeated in schoolyards and online forums for decades. It is a perfect example of how audiences find hidden meaning in details that were never designed to carry any. Scar's musical number contains visual symbolism that operates on a level most viewers, especially younger ones, never consciously register, but absorb nonetheless. The staging of that sequence deliberately echoes imagery associated with real-world authoritarian regimes. The hyenas march in rigid formation. Shadows fall in sharp geometric patterns. Scar stands elevated above his followers in a posture that directly mirrors historical propaganda imagery. The visual language is unmistakable once you recognize it, and every frame was designed with that intention. The filmmakers wanted audiences to feel on a gut level that Scar's rise to power was deeply threatening, even if they lacked the political vocabulary to articulate why. By borrowing the visual grammar of oppression and control, the sequence communicates villainy and danger instinctively. It remains one of the most visually sophisticated moments in any animated film of that era, layering genuine political subtext beneath a performance that is, on its surface, darkly entertaining. Behind one of the film's most iconic vocal performances is a production secret that careful listeners have debated for years without ever reaching a definitive answer. Jeremy Irons, who gave Scar his unforgettable speaking voice, experienced significant vocal strain during a recording that made it physically impossible for him to complete the villain's big musical number with the power and intensity the sequence demanded. Jim Cummings, a veteran voice actor already working on production, stepped in and handled the most demanding sections. The transition was managed so carefully and skillfully during post-production that most audiences have watched the scene dozens of times without detecting the switch. The exact moment where one voice ends and the other begins has been debated by devoted fans for years, without either performer ever giving a definitive answer. It remains one of those small but fascinating production secrets that only deepens appreciation for the invisible craft behind every scene. Matthew Broderick, who voiced adult Simba, famously believed when he first signed on that he was joining a project connected to Kimba the White Lion, a well-known Japanese animated series from the 1960s featuring a strikingly similar premise. The confusion was genuine, and it pointed toward a much larger debate that followed the film for years. Fans of the original Kimba series noted visual and thematic similarities that they felt went beyond coincidence, raising serious questions about creative influence. Disney consistently maintained that the film was entirely original, but the conversation persisted across fan communities and documentaries long after theatrical release. Broderick's mix-up became one of the most frequently repeated anecdotes in the film's production history, a small human moment that accidentally illuminated one of its most complicated and unresolved controversies. The hyenas in early script drafts were written as genuinely menacing creatures, frightening and capable of real violence, with a tone designed to feel like a constant and unsettling threat. But as the story developed, the filmmakers recognized that the scenes involving Mufasa already carried enormous emotional weight, and stacking relentless menace on top of that grief threatened to make the entire experience overwhelming. The decision to give the hyenas comic personalities lightened the darker stretches of narrative significantly, but it had an unintended effect on the villain, with the hyenas becoming comedic. Scar had to carry nearly the entire weight of the story's threat by himself. He became sharper, more manipulative, and psychologically more dangerous in order to compensate. The rebalancing made him one of the most compelling animated villains ever created, and it gave the film a tonal range that allowed audiences to laugh and grieve within the same story. What became the film's romantic centerpiece was originally conceived as a comedic musical number performed by Timon and Pumbaa, who would have narrated and jokingly commented on the reunion between Simba and Nala. turning a pivotal emotional moment into something playful and light. The creative team recognized that sincerity was the only choice that could serve the story at that particular point. Nala's return is not simply a romantic reunion. It is the catalyst that forces Simba to confront everything he has been running from for years. Playing that moment for laughs would have collapsed the emotional foundation of the entire second half of the film. The final version allowed audiences to feel the depth of two characters reconnecting after years of separation, and it set the emotional stage for everything that followed. What could have been a forgettable comedic detour became one of the most emotionally resonant scenes in the film. Some of the most beloved moments in the movie were never in any script. Nathan Lane and Ernie Sabella, who voiced Timon and Pumbaa, were known for riffing freely during recording sessions, generating lines and reactions the writers had never imagined. Their chemistry was electric and entirely natural, built from spontaneity rather than direction. What made this exceptional was how seriously the animation team took those improvised performances. Rather than editing the recordings to fit pre-planned sequences, animators redesigned entire scenes around what the actors had delivered in the booth. Facial expressions, physical timing, and comedic rhythm were all shaped to match performances that had emerged organically in the recording studio. Timon and Pumbaa felt genuinely alive and unpredictable in ways that scripted dialogue rarely achieves. And that quality came directly from the freedom both actors were given to discover their characters in real time. Long before audiences heard the song that became one of the film's signature musical moments, a completely different number called Warthog Rhapsody occupied that same narrative space. It introduced the same characters and served a similar story function, but it lacked the emotional clarity the story needed at that critical point. The replacement song did not just entertain. It gave the audience a window into an entire philosophy, a specific way of approaching pain and avoidance that would define Simba's years in exile and become central to his character arc throughout the second act. Cutting the original and starting again was a bold decision made well into production, but the willingness to let go of something that worked in order to find something that worked better is exactly the kind of creative courage that separates good films from great ones. Rafiki was originally conceived as an almost entirely silent character, a mysterious presence who communicated through gestures and expressions rather than words. The concept was atmospheric and visually interesting, but it created a pacing problem that became impossible to ignore as the story developed. Simba's journey back to Pride Rock needed a catalyst with energy, humor, and a personality strong enough to break through years of avoidance and guilt. A silent figure watching from the trees was not going to accomplish that. Giving Rafiki a fully expressive voice, one full of warmth, eccentricity, and unexpected humor, transformed him from a background presence into one of the film's most memorable characters. His scenes with Simba became some of the most emotionally charged in the entire film precisely because they balanced profound themes with genuine lightness. He became proof that wisdom does not require solemnity, that the deepest truths can arrive through laughter and unpredictability. Just months before the film was due to be completed, the 1994 Northridge earthquake struck the Los Angeles area with devastating force. Studios were damaged. Facilities became unusable overnight. A team racing against an immovable release deadline suddenly found themselves dealing with a natural disaster that threatened to unravel years of work. Rather than halting production, the crew adapted with a speed and determination that, in retrospect, feels almost mythological. Artists set up workstations in homes, garages, and any space with power and light. Equipment was moved wherever it was needed. Work continued under conditions nobody had planned for, while many team members were simultaneously dealing with personal losses and damaged homes. The fact that the film was delivered on schedule despite everything remains one of the most impressive logistical and human achievements in Disney animation history. And the parallel between what the crew lived through and what the story on screen was about, a community facing destruction and rebuilding through collective effort, is entirely unintentional but impossible to ignore. Across its many releases over the decades, small visual differences have quietly appeared between editions of the film. Colors were adjusted, frames were cleaned, certain details were subtly altered between the original theatrical cut, VHS releases, DVD editions, Blu-ray transfers, and streaming versions. These changes were rarely announced and almost never noticeable during casual viewing, but they were absolutely real. They're the reason longtime fans have found themselves in heated debates about specific visual details, only to discover that both parties were right. because they were literally watching different versions of the same film. The sheer number of formats through which this movie has passed means it's been remastered and retransferred multiple times, with each pass introducing its own subtle variations. For devoted fans, cataloging these differences has become its own form of archaeological research. Behind one of the film's most beloved and cheerful songs lies a legal dispute that played out far from public view for years. The melody carried a complicated authorship history, with serious disagreements over who deserved credit and compensation for its creation. Songwriting collaborations frequently blur the lines of individual contribution, and when a song becomes a global phenomenon generating revenue across film releases, merchandise, stage productions, theme park usage, and licensing agreements across multiple industries simultaneously, those blurred lines can quickly become legal battlegrounds. The matter was eventually resolved through formal legal proceedings, with credit and royalties settled accordingly. But the story serves as a powerful reminder that even the most joyful and uncomplicated moments in entertainment can carry years of professional conflict for the people who actually created them. When a stage adaptation was first announced, widespread skepticism was immediate and entirely reasonable. Translating a beloved animated film into a live theatrical experience with human performers representing animals on a physical stage seemed like something that would inevitably disappoint. What director Julie Taymor delivered instead was something nobody had anticipated. Rather than recreating the animation, she built a production around puppetry, elaborate masks, and extraordinary physical performance in which the theatrical craft was never hidden from the audience but placed proudly at the center of the experience. The result became one of the longest-running and highest-grossing productions in Broadway history, spawning dozens of international productions and running for decades. It proved something remarkable about this story, that its emotional power was never dependent on animation. It could be completely reimagined in an entirely different medium and still move audiences to tears in exactly the same places. One later home video release inserted a new musical sequence that had not existed in the original 1994 theatrical version. For viewers who grew up with that updated edition, the song felt native to the film. For those who remember the original, it was a jarring and unexpected addition that altered the pacing of a story many considered perfectly balanced. The revision created something genuinely unusual. Two groups of fans with fundamentally different memories of the same film, neither of whom was wrong, and neither of whom always realized the other had watched something different. Online debates about specific scenes turned out to be arguments between people comparing editions without knowing it. The film now exists in multiple forms, and which version someone encountered first shapes their entire understanding of it. The fake blooper reel included in home video special features was one of the most cleverly conceived bonus features ever made for an animated film. Every stumbled line, every awkward reaction, every moment of apparent on-set chaos was carefully and intentionally animated from scratch by the same team that made the movie itself. The humor came from treating drawn characters as though they had the working lives of real actors, complete with flub takes, forgotten cues, and interpersonal friction during long shoot days. It resonated so strongly with audiences that it was later adopted by other major animated productions and became a genre of bonus feature in its own right. It worked because it invited viewers to see the characters not as drawings, but as personalities, as beings with existences beyond the frame, which is perhaps the highest compliment you can pay to the people who drew them. What all of these stories share, beneath the myths and production crises and the creative pivots and the legal battles, is a picture of film that was genuinely made against the odds by people who believed in it when the institution around them did not. It was an underdog story being made by a team living their own underdog story. The accidental poetry of that parallel is not lost when you step back and see the whole picture. The Lion King was never supposed to be the one everyone remembered. It was never supposed to be the film that redefined what animated storytelling could achieve. It became those things because the people who built it had something to prove and the creative freedom to prove it. Every secret hidden inside this production ultimately leads back to that same truth. Great art rarely arrives on schedule, fully formed and exactly as planned. It gets discovered along the way, in the spaces between the versions, in the decisions made under pressure, in the moments when the only choice is to keep going.